Halima, please put whatever past you have behind you. Just know that I am truly rooting for you.
Halima.
I am so happy for both of you today.
Thank you so much, Mother.
I promise to make her happy every day.
I am done with you. I am leaving.
My husband married me knowing my past, then used it against me in every argument for 10 years. On the morning I finally packed my belongings and left my marriage of 10 years, my husband stood in our bedroom doorway and asked me in the same calm, almost gentle voice he had used 1,000 times before, whether I really thought any other man would want a woman with my history. I did not answer him. I zipped my last bag, looked at him for a long moment, and walked past him toward a life I should have claimed for myself years earlier. Before I tell you what that history actually was, before I tell you about the man who quietly shaped my husband into the person capable of using it against me for a decade, and before I tell you what finally broke 10 years of silence in a single ordinary Tuesday evening, let me say this. If someone has ever promised to accept all of you and then spent years reminding you that acceptance came with a price, stay with me until the end, because this is not a story about my past. It is a story about what disrespect looks like when it wears the mask of love for 10 patient years. If this is your first time here, subscribe now, because I promise you, the reason my husband never let go of my history was not really about my history at all. And the person who taught him to wield it against me is not who I suspected for most of our marriage. My name is Halima, and I am originally from Kaduna, though I have lived most of my adult life in Kano, where I moved after marrying my husband Sani 10 years ago. Before I met Sani, I had already been married once before, at 18 years old, in an arranged marriage typical of the kind many young women in my community entered into in those years, a marriage that ended after less than 2 years amid a scandal that followed me for a long time afterward, an accusation delivered by my first husband's family that I had been unfaithful during our brief union, an accusation I have always maintained and still maintain today was entirely false, though the truth of it mattered far less to the community around me at the time than the simple fact that a young divorced woman carrying that particular rumor was considered by many people's estimation permanently diminished. I remember the specific afternoon that first marriage effectively ended, being called into my father-in-law's sitting room to face a room full of relatives already assembled, already certain of my guilt before I had spoken a single word in my own defense, my first husband himself sitting silently in the corner, refusing to meet my eyes, offering no support and no explanation for the accusation being leveled against me by his own mother and aunts. I remember protesting my innocence as clearly and as calmly as my shock and fear allowed, but I could see even then that nothing I said was going to change the outcome that room had already decided upon before I entered it. I was sent back to my parents' house within the week, the divorce finalized quickly and quietly, the way such matters were often handled, leaving me at 20 years old carrying a reputation I had done nothing to earn and no clear path to ever fully clearing it. I want you to understand what those years between my first divorce and meeting Sani actually felt like, because they matter enormously for understanding why his eventual promise to accept me completely felt at the time like such an enormous gift. I spent nearly 4 years living quietly with my parents, watching younger cousins marry ahead of me, absorbing the particular weight of being discussed in hushed, pitying tones by relatives who believed my chances at a respectable second marriage had narrowed considerably. I remember overhearing more than once aunties discussing my situation in the next room, their voices lowered but not quite low enough, debating whether any decent family would ever consider me again, whether I ought to simply resign myself to a quieter, unmarried life, supporting my parents in their old age, rather than continuing to hope for a marriage of my own. I did not deserve that treatment. I had done nothing wrong in my first marriage beyond being young and unlucky enough to be paired with a man whose family I later came to believe invented the infidelity accusation to cover for problems within their own household that had nothing to do with me. but understanding then is a different thing entirely from being protected from the consequences, and I carried those consequences alone before Sani entered my life. I spent much of that period teaching myself tailoring, first informally under an older neighbor who took pity on my situation and offered to train me in exchange for help around her own home, and later with growing skill and confidence that gave me at least some sense of purpose during years that otherwise felt suspended, waiting for a future I was increasingly uncertain would ever arrive. I remember finding genuine satisfaction in that work, the first thing in those difficult years that felt entirely mine, untouched by the rumor that had followed me out of my first marriage. And though I could not have known it then, that quiet skill would eventually become the business that gave me many years later the financial independence that made leaving my second marriage possible at all.
Sani and I met through a mutual family connection, introduced by an aunt of his who knew my mother from their years together in a trading association. I remember being wary during our first several meetings, certain that once he learnt my full history, the same coldness I had encountered from other prospective suitors would settle over him too. That familiar polite retreat I had come to recognize in men who initially seemed interested until word of my past inevitably reached them through some relative or family friend. I remember our first meeting specifically, sitting stiffly across from him in my family's sitting room, while our respective aunties hovered nearby, pretending not to listen, both of us exchanging careful, formal pleasantries. Neither of us fully believed the other was invested in continuing beyond that single obligatory visit. But Sani surprised me, returning for a second visit, then a third, each time asking questions that revealed a genuine curiosity about who I actually was, rather than the guarded, performative small talk I had grown accustomed to from other prospective suitors during those difficult years. He asked about my tailoring work with real interest, wanting to understand the techniques I had taught myself, asking thoughtful questions that made clear he was actually listening rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. I remember allowing myself, cautiously, to enjoy those early conversations, even while some guarded part of me kept waiting for the inevitable moment his family would intervene once they learned about my first marriage. Instead, he told me, during our fourth meeting, sitting in my family's modest sitting room with a directness that genuinely moved me, that he had already heard about my first marriage before our families ever formally introduced us, that he did not believe the accusation against me, and that he was not interested in marrying a woman without a past. He wanted to marry me entirely, including everything I had already lived through. I remember his exact words, which I have turned over in my mind so many times in the years since that they remain as clear to me now as they were that afternoon. I am not afraid of what people say about you. I am interested in who you actually are, and everything I have seen of that person I like very much. I remember the specific, overwhelming relief that washed over me hearing those words. 4 years of accumulated shame and diminished hope suddenly loosening its grip all at once, replaced by something I had genuinely begun to fear I might never feel again, being seen fully and chosen anyway. I want you to hold on to that promise, because subscribe now, because everything that follows in this story is the slow, 10-year-long unraveling of exactly how much that promise turned out to be worth. We married 8 months after that conversation, a modest but joyful ceremony attended by both our families, and I remember standing beside Sani that day, feeling something I had genuinely believed I might never feel again, the sense of being fully known and fully chosen anyway. My mother cried through most of the ceremony, tears of genuine relief rather than the merely obligatory tears mothers sometimes shed at weddings. And I remember catching her eye at one point and seeing reflected there the full weight of the 4 anxious years she had spent watching my prospects narrow, finally released. Our early years together were, by most measures, happy ones. Sani worked steadily in his family's transport business, managing a growing fleet of commercial vehicles that operated routes between Kano and several neighboring states, work that kept him reasonably busy but rarely away from home for extended periods. I eventually opened a small tailoring shop that grew slowly but steadily over the years, starting with a single rented room barely large enough for 2 sewing machines, and gradually expanding as my reputation for quality work spread through word of mouth among women in our neighborhood. We welcomed 2 children into our home within the first 5 years of marriage, a daughter first and then a son. And I remember Sani's genuine tenderness during those early years of parenthood, staying up with me during difficult nights, proudly introducing our children to visiting relatives, seemingly in every visible way, exactly the devoted husband and father I had hoped he would become. From the outside, I imagine our marriage looked to most of the people around us like a genuine success story. The story of a good man who looked past a woman's difficult history and built something lasting with her regardless. A narrative I heard repeated back to me more than once by relatives and neighbors who seemed to view our marriage as a kind of quiet inspiration. Proof that a woman's early misfortune need not permanently determine her future happiness. I believed that narrative myself, wholeheartedly, for longer than I am now comfortable admitting, genuinely convinced during those early years that I had found, against considerable odds, exactly the partnership I had once feared I would never be offered a second chance to build. What almost nobody outside our home ever witnessed was the particular way Sani began, gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, to weaponize the very history he had claimed to fully accept. If you have ever had someone use your most painful chapter as a quiet recurring punishment disguised as ordinary marital conflict, stay with me, because subscribe now, because what I am about to describe took me far longer to recognize clearly than it probably should have, and understanding why it took so long is part of what makes this story worth telling honestly. The first instance I remember clearly came during an argument in our 3rd year of marriage, over something almost embarrassingly small. I had spent slightly more than we had agreed on fabric for my tailoring shop that month, a minor overspend that would have been, in any healthy marriage, a 5-minute conversation about budgeting. I remember the evening clearly, both of us tired after long days, our daughter fussing in the next room, while I tried to explain patiently that a particular fabric supplier had raised prices unexpectedly and that I had judged the quality worth the additional cost for an important client's order.
Instead, Sani's voice hardened in a way I had not heard from him before, his expression shifting from ordinary irritation into something colder, more deliberate. And in the middle of that ordinary disagreement, he said something that landed like a physical blow. Is this the kind of judgment I should expect from a woman who could not even manage to stay faithful in her first marriage? I remember the specific, disorienting silence that followed his words, the way the room itself seemed to hold its breath alongside me, because nothing about overspending on fabric had anything logically to do with an accusation from a marriage that had ended nearly 6 years earlier, an accusation he himself had told me before we married that he did not believe. I remember staring at him, waiting for some acknowledgement that he had said something strange, something cruel, some flicker of recognition that he had reached for a weapon entirely disproportionate to a conversation about fabric costs. Instead, he simply moved on to discussing the budget itself as though the comment had cost him nothing at all to make, continuing the conversation in the same measured tone he had used before, as if he had not just reached backward 6 years and pulled out the single most painful chapter of my life to punish me for a decision about cotton and thread. I told myself that first time that it was an aberration, a moment of genuine frustration that had reached for the nearest available weapon rather than any deliberate cruelty. And I did not raise it with him directly, not wanting to seem as though I was making too much of a single unkind sentence in an otherwise good marriage. If you have ever excused someone's first cruelty because the alternative felt like overreacting, subscribe now. Because that single decision to let the first instance pass without confrontation is, I now understand, one of the quiet hinges on which the entire following decade turned. The pattern, once it began, did not escalate quickly or dramatically. That, I think, is part of what made it so difficult to recognize and eventually so difficult to leave. Sani was never violent, never openly humiliating in front of others, never the kind of husband whose cruelty would have been immediately obvious to anyone watching our marriage from the outside. Instead, over the following years, he developed an almost surgical precision for invoking my past at exactly the moment I felt most vulnerable, most in need of his support rather than his judgment. When I struggled with postpartum exhaustion after our second child, weeks of overwhelming fatigue and tearfulness I now understand, looking back, was likely some form of postpartum depression I never had the language or the medical support to properly name at the time. He suggested during a particularly low moment, when I could barely find the energy to explain what I was feeling, that perhaps my difficulty adjusting to motherhood reflected something unstable in my character that had shown itself before in my first marriage. I remember the specific cruelty of that comment landing at exactly the moment I most needed comfort rather than judgment, a pattern I would come to recognize painfully as almost deliberate in its timing, though I could not have named it that clearly in the moment itself. When I proposed expanding my tailoring business to include a small retail section, requiring a loan I would need his signature to secure, he questioned aloud in front of the loan officer himself whether a woman with my complicated history could really be trusted with additional financial responsibility. A comment that humiliated me so completely in that moment that I withdrew the loan application entirely rather than continue enduring his doubt made public. I remember the loan officer's uncomfortable expression, his eyes flicking between the two of us, clearly unsure how to proceed after such an unexpected, personal comment. And I remember gathering my documents afterward with hands that would not quite stop shaking, driving home in silence, while Sani beside me seemed entirely unaware that he had done anything worth remarking on. There were other moments too, smaller ones that accumulated over the years into a kind of constant background hum of vulnerability. A comment during a disagreement about which school our children should attend, questioning whether my judgment about their upbringing could be trusted, given everything that happened before. A remark during a minor illness that kept me in bed for several days, wondering aloud whether my body's weakness reflected some deeper instability. A joke delivered in front of his mother on a holiday visit about how lucky I was that he had been willing to overlook my history, delivered with a smile that made the comment sound, to anyone not paying close attention, like harmless affection, rather than the quiet threat it actually represented. If you are recognizing any of this in your own life, stay with me, because subscribe now, because the specific mechanism by which this kind of quiet cruelty operates, never quite crossing into something you could easily name and confront, always leaving just enough plausible deniability that raising it directly felt like you were the one overreacting, is exactly what kept me trapped in this pattern for far longer than I'm proud to admit. I want to describe as honestly as I can what those 10 years actually did to me internally, because I think this part of the story matters more than the individual incidents themselves. I became, gradually, a smaller version of the woman I had been when Sani and I first met, second-guessing my own judgment on decisions I once would have made confidently, apologizing preemptively for opinions I had not yet even fully expressed, developing a kind of constant, low-grade vigilance around any topic that might even tangentially provide him an opening to invoke my first marriage. I stopped somewhere in those middle years, even bringing up genuine grievances of my own, because I had learned through repeated painful experience that any conflict I initiated ran the risk of being redirected within minutes into a referendum on my past character, rather than whatever legitimate concern I had actually raised. My own family noticed the change in me before I was willing to name it myself. My younger sister, Zainab, visited us during our 7th year of marriage and pulled me aside one evening, asking me directly whether everything was truly well between Sani and I, telling me I had grown quieter, more careful in a way that worried her. I remember deflecting her concern that evening, telling her marriage simply required compromise, that Sani and I had our disagreements like any couple, but that our foundation remained strong. Words I recited with a practiced ease that surprised even me, because some part of me had clearly already built an entire vocabulary for defending a marriage I was, underneath that defense, growing increasingly unable to fully justify even to myself.
If you want to understand exactly how this pattern finally cracked open after 10 years of careful containment, stay with me, because subscribe now, because the person who ultimately helped me see the fuller picture of what had been happening was not who I would have expected, and what she revealed to me about Sani's own father changed everything I thought I understood about where his cruelty had actually originated. The unraveling began unexpectedly through Sani's older sister, Fatima, a woman I had always maintained a warm, if somewhat distant relationship with over the years, someone who lived several hours away and whom I saw mainly during major family gatherings. She visited us during our 9th year of marriage, staying for nearly 2 weeks while recovering from a minor surgery, and I remember genuinely enjoying having her in our home during that stay, the two of us falling into an easy companionship in the kitchen most evenings, cooking together and talking about our respective children while she recovered her strength. During that extended stay, she witnessed directly one of Sani's characteristic comments, a small remark delivered during an otherwise unremarkable dinner conversation about our daughter's school performance, in which Sani suggested, almost casually, that our daughter's occasional stubbornness might be something she inherited, a phrase whose implication was unmistakable to anyone who understood the family shorthand for referencing my past. I remember not even fully reacting to the comment myself in that moment. So accustomed had I become, after nearly 9 years, to absorbing such remarks without visible response, continuing to serve the meal as though nothing unusual had been said at all. Fatima did not say anything in that moment, but I noticed her expression shift, a flicker of something between recognition and discomfort that told me she had understood exactly what he meant, and something in the careful way she watched the rest of that dinner conversation unfold told me she was seeing our marriage, perhaps for the first time in nearly a decade of periodic family visits, with genuinely fresh eyes. She found me alone in the kitchen later that evening, and what she told me, haltingly, apologetically, reframed an entire decade of my marriage in a way I was not prepared for. She told me that their father, Alhaji Bello, had never fully approved of Sani's decision to marry me, that he had voiced serious reservations before our wedding about the risk of marrying a woman with a documented divorce and an infidelity accusation attached to her name, regardless of whether that accusation was true, worried openly that such a marriage might reflect poorly on the family's standing within their business and social community. Fatima told me that their father had never openly forbidden the marriage, understanding that Sani was determined to proceed regardless, but that he had instead taken a different approach in the years since. Quiet, private conversations with Sani, conducted mostly away from the rest of the family, in which he counseled his son on how to manage a wife with my particular history, advice that Fatima herself had only partially overheard over the years, but that she described uncomfortably as consistently centered on the idea that I should be reminded periodically and without excessive drama of exactly what Sani had taken on by marrying me, framed to Sani not as cruelty, but as a kind of prudent marital management, a way of ensuring I remained appropriately grateful and appropriately compliant rather than growing too confident or too independent within the marriage. If you are feeling the particular horror I felt in that kitchen, hold on to it, because subscribe now, because the person who ultimately helped me see the fuller picture of what had been happening was not who I would have expected, and what she revealed to me about Sani's own father changed everything I thought I understood about where his cruelty had actually originated. I did not confront Sani immediately after that conversation with Fatima, needing time to fully absorb what it meant, that the cruelty I had spent a decade privately excusing as occasional lapses in an otherwise good man's judgment had in fact been cultivated deliberately, coached across years of private conversation with his own father, a strategy rather than a series of isolated failures. I spent nearly a month turning that knowledge over in my mind, revisiting incident after incident from our 10 years together with fresh, painful clarity, understanding now that comments I once excused as momentary frustration had actually been the visible surface of an ongoing, deliberate pattern I had never had full visibility into. I remember lying awake many nights during that month, Sani sleeping soundly beside me, running through a mental catalogue of every comment I had ever quietly absorbed and filed away as an isolated lapse, understanding now that each one belonged to a much longer, more deliberate thread than I had allowed myself to recognize at the time. I thought about the loan officer incident, the postpartum comment, and the countless smaller remarks scattered across a decade, each one individually dismissible, but together forming a pattern so consistent it could not possibly have been accidental. I found myself grieving during that month, not just for the specific cruelty itself, but for the version of myself who had spent nearly 10 years working so hard to excuse it, wondering how much of my own diminished confidence over those years had been the direct, intended result of a strategy I had never even known I was up against. I also spent much of that month observing Sani with a new, careful attentiveness, watching for patterns I had perhaps normalized too completely to notice clearly before. The particular way his tone shifted whenever a conversation touched even distantly on questions of judgment or trust, the almost reflexive ease with which certain phrases seemed to surface whenever he felt cornered or challenged in an argument. What I saw during that month of careful observation only confirmed what Fatima had revealed, a behavior so consistent and so practiced that I found myself wondering uncomfortably how I had managed to convince myself for so long that it was anything other than deliberate. The confrontation, when it finally came, was not the dramatic, single, explosive argument you might expect from a story like this. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening, nearly 10 years to the month since our wedding, over another small disagreement, this time about whether our son should be permitted to attend a weekend football tournament in a neighboring town, a genuinely minor parenting decision that should have never required the weight I was about to bring to it. When Sani predictably reached for the familiar weapon, suggesting that my hesitation about the trip reflected the same poor judgment that had already cost me one marriage, I did something I had not done in 10 years of marriage. I did not apologize, did not deflect, did not quietly absorb the comment and move the conversation forward, the way I had trained myself to do across a decade of similar moments. I simply asked him, calmly, to explain to me exactly what my judgment in raising two healthy, well-adjusted children and running a successful business for 8 years had to do with an accusation from a marriage that ended before either of us even met.
If you want to know exactly what he said in response, and why it finally broke something in me that 10 years of smaller cruelties had not fully broken, stay with me. Because subscribe now. His answer that Tuesday evening is the moment I finally understood this was never really about my past at all. Sani did not have a coherent answer to my question. Not really. And I think that absence of any real answer told me more than any explanation could have. He fell back instead on a kind of wounded defensiveness, accusing me of twisting his words, of being too sensitive, of failing to appreciate everything he had overlooked in choosing to marry me in the first place. Language I recognized instantly with a clarity that felt almost physical, as an echo of exactly what Fatima had described his father giving him for years. I asked him directly, for the first time in our marriage, whether his father had ever advised him on how to handle me, on how to keep me appropriately humble about my past, and I watched something shift in his face, not quite shame, but something close enough to it that I understood immediately that Fatima's account had been accurate. He admitted it eventually, haltingly, sitting across from me at our dining table with an expression I had rarely seen him before, something closer to genuine discomfort than his usual defensive certainty, that his father had indeed spoken to him many times over the years about managing expectations within our marriage, about not letting me forget the grace I had been shown by marrying into their family despite my history. He described, when I pressed him for specifics, occasions I remembered clearly from my own side, visits to his parents' house after which he had returned unusually quiet, private phone calls with his father that he had always dismissed as ordinary business discussions about the transport company. Conversations I now understood had likely, at least sometimes, included this quieter counsel about how to keep me appropriately humble. He claimed, even then, to have received that counsel with some private discomfort, telling me he had never fully agreed with his father's framing of our marriage as something requiring careful management, but had nonetheless internalized and repeated it back to me, year after year, in moments he had convinced himself were simply honest expressions of frustration rather than a deliberate inherited strategy of control. I asked him directly whether he had ever considered, even once across 10 years, simply refusing his father's counsel outright, telling him clearly that such comments had no place in how he treated his wife, and he had no good answer for that question either, falling into an uncomfortable silence that told me more than any words could have. I want to be honest that even in that moment of admission, Sani did not seem to fully grasp the weight of what he was confessing, treating it more as an unfortunate influence he had absorbed rather than a decade of choices he himself had made repeatedly to wound me with something I had trusted him to protect rather than exploit. He seemed to expect, I think, that simply naming the source of his behavior itself might constitute a kind of resolution, as though understanding where the cruelty came from should automatically excuse the years I had spent absorbing it, an expectation that told me, even in that vulnerable moment of confession, how far he still had to travel before he could genuinely understand the harm he had caused rather than simply explain its origin. If you are wondering whether that admission changed anything, stay with me, because subscribe now. What I want you to understand clearly is that my decision to finally leave this marriage was not, in the end, about that confession or about my first marriage at all. It was about something simpler and harder to forgive. I want to be very precise here because I think it matters enormously to the honesty of this story. I did not leave Sani because of what happened in my first marriage, or even, fully, because of his father's toxic counsel, understanding as I eventually came to that Alhaji Bello's influence explained the origin of Sani's cruelty without in any way excusing his decade-long choice to keep practicing it. I left because, across 10 years, my husband had access to my most painful chapter and chose, again and again, deliberately or not, to use it as a tool rather than protect it as a confidence. And no explanation for where that habit originated could undo the simple, accumulated fact of a decade spent married to a man who could not, in the end, be trusted with my full self the way he had once promised he would be. I gave Sani one final opportunity in the weeks following that Tuesday confrontation to demonstrate that something might genuinely change, a condition I set clearly, that any further reference to my first marriage in any argument about anything would end our marriage without further discussion. I want to tell you that I set that condition with confidence, but the truth is I set it half hoping he would finally prove capable of honoring it, still carrying, even after everything, some remaining hope that 10 years of marriage and 2 children together might be worth salvaging if the underlying cruelty could genuinely stop. If you want to know what finally confirmed beyond any doubt that real change was not coming, stay with me, because subscribe now. The incident that ended my marriage, when it finally came, was almost disappointingly small, and I think that smallness is exactly why it finally convinced me completely. It happened during a family gathering at Sani's parents' house, nearly 3 months after our confrontation, a large event attended by extended relatives from both sides of our families, celebrating his younger cousin's engagement. The compound was full of the particular warm chaos of a Nigerian family celebration, children running between the legs of adults, the smell of jollof rice and grilled meat drifting from the kitchen.
Aunties comparing notes on the engaged couple's prospects, while uncles debated politics in loud, good-natured voices near the gate. I had suggested, in a private conversation with Sani earlier that week, that we might consider hosting a similar gathering ourselves later that year to celebrate our own upcoming 10th anniversary. A suggestion I made with genuine warmth, hoping to mark the milestone properly despite everything we had been working through privately. Sani agreed at the time, seemingly pleased by the idea, even suggesting a few relatives we might invite, a conversation that had left me feeling, for the first time in months, genuinely hopeful about where our marriage might be heading. But at the gathering itself, in front of nearly 30 relatives seated around low tables in the compound's courtyard, when his father asked, seemingly innocently, whether Sani and I had any special anniversary plans, Sani laughed, a little too loudly, glancing briefly toward his father in a way that struck me, even in that instant, as somehow performative, and said, "We will see. Not everyone gets a fairy tale anniversary after everything that came before." A comment delivered lightly enough that most of the room seemed to register it as ordinary marital teasing, rather than what I immediately recognized it to be, a public, casual invocation of exactly the history he had sworn 3 months earlier never to weaponize again. I remember the particular sensation of that moment, the laughter continuing around us as though nothing significant had been said, while I sat perfectly still, feeling something inside me settle with a finality I had not expected to arrive so quietly, in the middle of a celebration, surrounded by people who had no idea what they had just witnessed. I did not make a scene at that gathering. I smiled the way I had trained myself to do across a decade of similar moments, and said nothing until we were alone in the car afterward, at which point I told him, calmly and without raising my voice, that our marriage was over. He seemed genuinely surprised, protesting that his comment had been just a joke, that I was overreacting to something small after everything else we had already walked through. And I remember feeling in that moment a strange, settled clarity rather than any renewed anger, because his surprise itself confirmed exactly what I needed to know. 3 months of careful behavior had not represented genuine change. It had represented restraint, a temporary suppression of a habit he still fundamentally did not understand as harmful, ready to resurface the moment he judged the stakes low enough, the audience casual enough, to risk it again. If there is one thing I want you to take from everything I have shared with you today, it is this. Someone can know your entire painful history and choose every single day for a decade whether to hold it gently or wield it as a weapon, and the choice they make across those thousands of small moments tells you far more about their character than any single grand promise made before a wedding ever could. I left Sani not because I was ashamed of my past, but because I finally understood, after 10 years, that my past was never actually the problem in our marriage. His disrespect was. I have been living independently for 8 months now, my tailoring business thriving in ways I do not think it ever could have, while I was shrinking myself daily inside that marriage. My children adjusting, slowly but steadily, to a new rhythm of life between 2 households. I moved into a small flat closer to my shop, modest but entirely my own, and I remember the first night sleeping there, alone in a bed I had chosen myself, feeling a quiet, unfamiliar sense of peace that took me several weeks to fully recognize as simply the absence of the low, constant vigilance I had carried for a decade without ever fully naming it as such. My tailoring business has grown enough in these months that I have taken on my first apprentice, a young woman not much older than I was during my own difficult years after my first divorce, and I find myself teaching her, unexpectedly moved by the chance to offer someone else the kind of patient encouragement I once badly needed myself. I have also in these months finally sought out someone from my first husband's family, an older cousin of his, who, after years of silence, admitted to me privately that the infidelity accusation against me had indeed been fabricated, orchestrated by a jealous relative in that household who had her own reasons for wanting my first marriage to end, a truth that arrived far too late to undo years of quiet shame, but that still somehow mattered enormously to finally hear spoken aloud by someone with no remaining reason to lie to me. I remember sitting with that confirmation for a long while afterward, feeling a strange, layered grief, relief at finally having the truth acknowledged, alongside a fresh anger at how many years of my life had been shaped by a lie that could have been corrected so much earlier by someone willing to simply tell the truth. My relationship with Sani remains civil, focused primarily on co-parenting our children, with as much stability and warmth as we can manage across two separate households. And I will say in fairness to him that he has continued in the months since our separation to reflect more honestly on his behavior than I initially expected, though I remain uncertain whether that reflection represents genuine lasting change or simply the natural consequence of finally facing real accountability for the first time in a decade. I do not know what his relationship with his father looks like now, as I have chosen deliberately not to ask, understanding that whatever repair or reckoning needs to happen there belongs to the two of them, separate from whatever peace I am still working to build for myself. If this story reminded you of a truth someone in your life has held over you, gently or otherwise, across years of quiet accumulation, I would love to hear about it, and I hope you will stay close because I have many more stories like this one still to tell. Subscribe before you go, not because I need the number to climb, but because somewhere out there, someone else is standing in a doorway right now, being asked whether anyone else would want them, and maybe this story reaches them with the reminder that the answer to that question was never the point in the first place.